Our collection of facts and stories continues now with the 1950s. Has the mystique of the Griffith Park curse waned, or has it actually grown stronger? Now let us go forward 10 years. On December 6, 1959, Dr. Harold Perelson would walk over to where his wife Lillian slept and bashed her over the head with a ball-peen hammer, killing her. He would then walk out of his bedroom and enter his 18-year-old daughter Judy's room. She awoke hearing him come into the room, but was not fast enough to stop him from hitting her in the head with the same hammer. She screamed while trying to fend him off. Perelson's two other children, 11-year-old Debbie and 13-year-old Joel, heard the screams of their sister, and Debbie went to investigate what was happening. Dr. Perelson would direct his attention to little Debbie, telling her, "Go back to bed. This is a nightmare." With his attention elsewhere, Judy managed to run out of her room and down the stairs to exit the front door. She would run into a neighbor's house and tell them what was happening. The neighbor would then bring Judy into his home and go up to the Perelson house. When inside, he would go up the stairs and encounter Dr. Perelson, who told him to go away. The neighbor told him to go lie down, and he called the police. Instead, Dr. Perelson would go into the bathroom and take out several bottles of pills. He would open 2 capsules of Nembutal and pour the contents into a glass with water and drink the yellow liquid. Then, according to the coroner's report, he took about 31 tablets of what was believed to be codeine and waited for the effects of the drugs to take hold of him. After about 15 minutes, the police would arrive to find him barely alive, and by the time the ambulance arrived at the house, he was dead. Judy would survive the attack after being taken to the hospital with a possible skull fracture. The other 2 children were unharmed and taken out of the house and to the neighbor's home. When police went over the scene and began bagging up pill bottles that were left out, they found a copy of Dante's Divine Comedy on the doctor's bedside table. It was open to Canto 1, which read, "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost." Family and friends were baffled by this tragedy. What could have been so bad that a man felt the need to kill his wife and almost his child? If Judy had not run out of the house and told the neighbor, would Dr. Perelson have killed his other 2 children? While going through paperwork in the house, police believed that Dr. Perelson was in some financial trouble. According to a friend of Lillian Perelson, only a month before Lillian was telling this friend that she felt a major catastrophe was about to happen. She would make an appointment with this friend to discuss the couple's financial problems, but Dr. Perelson refused to attend. Police would also find a note in Judy's car that was addressed to her aunt. It revealed that there was a lot of tension in the family, but it was from the same financial troubles her parents were having. She would say that things would be good with her father for a while, but then it would eventually get worse. She had been planning to get a job and make her own living so that it might help the situation her parents were in. She didn't want to be a burden. The police would try to reconstruct the events of the early morning and learn more about the Perelson family history, particularly Dr. Perelson. The Dr. Harold Perelson story can be thought of as one of those rags to riches stories. His parents were immigrants who came to America in hopes of a better life. In 1909, Harold was born in New York. He was the eldest of 4 children. When he grew up, he would attend medical school. After graduating, he would move to California. He had been a doctor in an Inglewood physician's office, published several papers in the field of neurology, and later became a cardiology professor at the USC School of Medicine. Dr. Perelson would marry Lillian Silver and start a family. In 1938, Perelson filed a patent for a hypodermic syringe for injecting drugs from ampules he designed. An ampule is a small, sealed glass jar that contains a liquid medicine. They are commonly used to contain pharmaceuticals and chemicals that must be protected from air and contaminants. He would spend a decade developing the syringe even more. In 1949, he would enter a verbal agreement with an Edward Shoestack, who wanted to help sell the idea to people in the medical profession. Once it became successful, they would split the profits. The Perelsons would invest $24,000 of their own earnings and savings into the product. On July 21, 1952, Dr. Perelson would sue Mr. Shoestack for $100,000 for using a fake name and stealing the rights to this device. Perelson wanted his money back plus compensation. After 2 years, the courts awarded Perelson $23,956. Around 1956, the Perelsons would find the perfect house for their family on Glendower Place in Los Feliz. In November of 1957, the 3 Perelson children were involved in a car crash and sustained injuries. Dr. Perelson would then sue the other driver for negligence while driving. He sought around $60,000 for the injuries the children received, but would only get a fraction of that amount, which would go to covering the medical bills. Before the murder-suicide, one newspaper alluded to Dr. Perelson having undergone psychiatric treatment in 1958. An itemized bill from the Temple Hospital in Los Angeles, where Dr. Perelson was being treated for 9 days, shows that one of the items billed was Thorazine, which is commonly used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So let's go over his life again. Perelson would grow up to be a doctor. He would marry and have a family. He would develop a new device that would aid the medical field. He would apply for a patent for this device. His life so far seemed to be going well. He also would find a beautiful home for his family to live in. Great. But now we get into some of the not-so-good periods. He sues a man for fraud and trying to steal the rights to his device. His children are harmed in a car accident and sustain some injuries. He sues the other driver, but only gets awarded enough money to pay the medical bills. He then is treated in a hospital with what appears to be some sort of mental disorder. Just before the murder-suicide, his wife and daughter both allude to financial issues that are causing a lot of tension in the household. I would say that all of these stressors could make anyone feel out of control, but add on a possible psychiatric issue that in the 1950s was probably not dealt with accurately because the medical profession was still learning about it. The children would live with other relatives back east, and their whereabouts are unknown to this day. After that night, none of the children returned to the house, and in 1960, the house, along with all the personal belongings of the Perelsons that were inside, were sold at auction to Mr. and Mrs. Julian Enrique. Instead of moving into their new home or emptying it of the Perelsons' belongings, it stood there uninhabited for decades. The Enriquez family used the house for storage and nothing more. When Mr. and Mrs. Enriquez passed away, the house was left to their son Rudy, who also never moved into it, but from time to time he would check on it. He had many offers to sell his property, but he always refused. He would say that he really didn't know what he was going to do with the house. By this time, the house was in disrepair from over 50 years of neglect. Neighbors would chain off the driveway, paint the front of the garage, and tidy up the front yard. There had been complaints of prostitutes bringing their johns into the house, and the homeless sleeping inside it as well. Random people would picnic on the unkept grounds, and objects from the interior and exterior of the house were stolen. People were very curious about this vacant mansion that basically was a time capsule from the time of the murder-suicide. Looking into the windows to see furniture, wrapping paper, books, and even entering the house to see clothes still in the closets. They were also curious about the tales of hauntings that were occurring inside. The owner would eventually place security alarms around the house. People would report hearing the alarms going off day and night, with no one around causing them to go off. Those who entered the house have said that they felt like they were being followed as they explored, and even after they left. There were reports of a woman staring down at people from a window and would slowly vanish from sight, of a woman screaming and moaning, and orbs flying through the air inside the house. Rudy Enriquez would pass away in 2015. He had no heirs, so the house would be sold. It was purchased, but those new owners would soon realize how much work would have to go into repairing this home. It would cost well over 50% of what the home cost to fix it. Plus, the house would have to be brought up to present-time building codes. The house was built on a steep slope, so it would have to be completely raised and the land flattened, which would consist of a lot of permits and paperwork. This was obviously too much for them, so the house was placed back on the market, and the new owners would have to deal with the same problems. As of writing this, the house has been stripped to the bare bones, and who knows what's in store for this shell of a home now. So, what do we think? Cursed grounds, or just a truly unfortunate tragedy that just so happened to be within Griffith Park? Hundreds of films, television shows, and commercials have been filmed in Griffith Park, but the most popular by far is Rebel Without a Cause. The interiors and exteriors of the Griffith Observatory were used in the film. Legend says that there was a curse related to this movie that may or may not have cost some of the actors involved their lives. Whether you believe in such a thing as a curse on a film, it is an overwhelming coincidence that 5 of the stars died traumatic deaths. The first victim, James Dean, played the main character Jim Stark. On September 21, 1955, James Dean had just finished filming his last picture, Giant. On this day, he bought himself a Porsche 550 Spyder for racing. Dean loved to race, but was not allowed to while filming. Over the next several days, he would have George Barris, the king of customs, detail the Spyder with red accents to the rear taillights, the number 130 on the hood and the sides of the car, and the most famous addition, the words "Little Bastard" painted on the back. On September 30th, 1955, Dean planned on racing the Little Bastard in a race in Salinas, California. He and his mechanic, Rolf Witherich, at some point decided that Dean should drive the Porsche to break in the new engine, with Rolf in the passenger seat. Dean would eventually collide with another car and die in the accident. His passenger Rolf would be thrown from the car and survive. Donald Turnipseed, the driver of the other car, would survive as well. Rolf would have a troubled life after the crash. He would undergo several surgeries for his injuries, with the crash causing psychological damage as well. He would suffer from depression, survivor's guilt, alcoholism, and would attempt suicide several times. In 1967, he would try to kill his 4th wife and himself. She would survive the attack, and Rolf would be sent to a mental institution. On July 22, 1981, while working at a Honda dealership in Germany, Rolf lost control of his car and crashed at a very high speed into a house. He died at the age of 53. Let's now return back to the Porsche Spyder after the crash and the events that followed with its new owners. After the accident, the insurance company would pay Dean's family a fair market value for the spider as settlement and place the mangled wreck in a salvage yard in Burbank. A Dr. William F. Esrich would buy the Porsche from the yard because he wanted to salvage parts that were usable for his own car. He, like Dean, loved racing. He even raced against Dean in a few races. The engine from the Spider was put into Esrich's Lotus 9 car. He had taken part in 7 racing events in 1956 and was involved in a minor scrape with another driver in one of them. Esrich had either sold or loaned another driver and fellow doctor, Dr. Troy McHenry, other parts that he had salvaged. In that same race, McHenry would lose control of his car in the first lap, crash into a tree, and die. The frame of the Spider would be sold to George Barris. He would attempt to put the mangled wreck back together and place it on display for a national highway safety tour. The car would be transported all over the country for a couple of years. During this time, there would be reports or rumors involving the Spider, giving the curse of the Dean car more substance. Stories of the car falling from its display and crushing a person's hip. A thief tried to steal the steering wheel and ended up breaking his arm. George Barris said that he had sold 2 of the tires to a man who would later tell George that they both blew at the same time. Luckily, he wasn't hurt. George Barkis, the truck driver transporting the car, would be crushed and killed when the car fell out of the truck. When in Florida, the Spider just fell apart into 11 pieces. Barris had the pieces boxed up and shipped back to Los Angeles. When the truck arrived, the boxes were no longer there, and after 63 years, they still haven't surfaced. Maybe for the sake of all of us, it's good they haven't turned up. We will now, just for a minute, rewind back to 1955 and James Dean. Post-production had not yet started on Dean's last film, Giant, when he died. His voice during his last speech in the film was not very clear, so it needed to be dubbed. To fill in the voice of James for the scene would be one of his Rebel Without a Cause castmates, Nick Adams. This brings us to our next victim. Nick Adams, whose character in Rebel was Chick. Nick had a good career in films and television, notably his leading role in the TV series The Rebel in 1959. In an episode of the Joey Bishop show titled The Big Date, his co-star was Jenny Maxwell. She will unfortunately play into the story a little later. His career began to decline during the early 60s. He would act in a few low-budget films and various television series episodes. He would go abroad to perform in Japanese films like Frankenstein vs. Baragon and the 6th Godzilla movie, Invasion of Astro Monster. On the night of February 7, 1968, Nick was supposed to meet his attorney, Irwin Tip Roeder, for dinner. When Nick didn't show up for the meal, Mr. Roeder drove to Nick's house to check on him. When he arrived, he saw Nick's car in the garage and went up to the house. He broke a window to gain entry into the home. He would find Nick slumped against the wall in his bedroom dead. Mr. Roeder called the police. The coroner's report stated that Nick died from an accidental overdose and undetermined. This was a sad ending to Nick Adams. But before we go on to the other Rebel stars, the story continues with Mr. Roeder and his future wife, Jenny Maxwell. Mr. Roeder would marry Nick's co-star, Jenny Maxwell, in 1970. Their marriage would last until 1981, when Mr. Roeder would file for divorce. He claimed Jenny had been unfaithful, though he seemed to do a lot of philandering himself. In June of 1981, Mr. Roeder was giving his soon-to-be ex a ride home to her condo when they were both shot in the lobby of the building. Both would die from their wounds, and burglary was thought to be the motive. Though nothing was taken, other stories were going to come to light as to who the guilty person might have been. It would be learned later, after a few of Mr. Roeder's associates would later state that he had been looking for a hitman to bump off his ex. Now, Mr. Roeder had no intention of giving his unfaithful wife alimony, so naturally one would look to end the wife's life. Obviously, he found someone to kill her and shoot him, most definitely not fatally, to keep the eyes of suspicion off him. Too bad that the hitman was very thorough in his job. The hitman was never found, but the rare ammunition that was used in the killing of the two was found in Mr. Roeder's Lincoln. Whether or not you can put these two deaths with the Rebel Without a Cause curse and the Griffith Park curse, I just couldn't help sharing that story and how perfectly it went with the Nick Adams death. Next in line for discussion as a possible victim is Edward Platt, who played the concerned police officer Ray Freemick. Edward went to Princeton University studying Romance languages. A year later, he left to study voice at the Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati, and later would attend Juilliard School of Music in New York. He would be a vocalist with Paul Whiteman's band, and then joined the Mozart Opera Company in New York. Before joining the Army during World War II, he would sing in a production of the operetta The Mikado in 1941. It turned out to be one of the shortest and most unpopular runs of the operetta. This was most definitely due to the fact that it debuted the day after the Pearl Harbor attack. After the war, he would go on to act on radio, stage, and then add films into the mix. Edward was a successful and continuously working actor in over 40 movies and over 100 roles on television. Some of his films include Steel Jungle, Cape Fear, Pollyanna, North by Northwest, and The Helen Morgan Story. His television work includes Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, Rawhide, Perry Mason, The Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, and Get Smart. Things seemed to be good for Edward, at least outwardly. On March 19, 1974, his building manager found him dead in his apartment. He was only 58. It was reported in the news that he had died from a heart attack. Years later, his son would tell us more about his father. Edward had been suffering for years from untreated depression and was dealing with financial troubles. He would go on to say that his father had actually committed suicide and that this had been his third attempt. Obviously, it looks like there had been a lot going on in his life, and not being treated for the depression his son spoke of must have made dealing with life's trials even more difficult, even to see that there can be a light at the end of the tunnel. Our next Rebel Without a Cause curse victim was Sal Mineo. Sal played the character Plato, was only 16 at the time of filming. He would be nominated for an Academy Award for his performance in that role. He would again be nominated for his performance as Dove Landau in the film Exodus in 1960. Sal would appear in several other films, such as Giant, with his Rebel co-stars James Dean and Dennis Hopper, Dino, The Gene Krupa Story, Tonka, and Escape from the Planet of the Apes. When not in films, he would take roles in many television series and movies like The Screen Actors Playhouse, Climax, Kraft Theater, Dr. Kildare, Combat, and Hawaii Five-0. Sal started his acting career on stage and returned to it in the late 60s, early 70s. On the night of February 12, 1976, Sal was returning home to his apartment on Holloway Drive after rehearsals for the stage play P.S. Your Cat is Dead. He parked his car and began to make his way to his apartment when he was attacked by a mugger who stabbed him in the heart. He fell to the ground bleeding and crying for help. One neighbor said he heard a man yelling, my God, help me!" Then there was one final scream and then silence. Several neighbors ran out, and one even tried to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but unfortunately Sal had passed away. It would be 3 years until Sal's killer was found and sentenced to 51 years to life. Lionel Ray Williams didn't know at first that the man he attacked and killed was the actor Sal Mineo, but he would brag about the killing to other inmates at the Michigan jail he was in. His wife at the time of the killing remembered her husband coming home with blood on his shirt that night. Such a sad ending for a brilliant star. Our last victim, Natalie Wood, played Judy to Dean's Jim. Natalie started acting as a child in the 1940s in such films as The Bride Wore Boots, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, Miracle on 34th Street, Scudda-Hoo, Scudda-Hay, and The Star. As a teenager in the 50s, she wanted to prove herself able to play more mature and serious roles. She fought to play the role of Judy, though the director Nicholas Ray didn't think she was right. On a drunken night out with Dennis Hopper, who too would be cast in Rebel, Natalie crashed her car. Nicholas Ray came to the hospital. While there, the doctor treating Natalie called her a goddamn juvenile delinquent. She yelled out to Ray, "Did you hear what he called me, Nick? He called me a goddamn juvenile delinquent. Now do I get the part?" Well, she did indeed get the part, and many more parts after her performance in Rebel. Other memorable films she starred in were West Side Story, Splendor in the Grass, Gypsy, The Great Race, Inside Daisy Clover, and Bob, Carol, Ted, and Alice. During a break from filming what would be her last film, Brainstorm, she, her husband, Robert Wagner, the ship's captain, Dennis Davern, and Natalie's co-star, Christopher Walken, spent the weekend of November 28, 1981, in Catalina on Wagner and Wood's yacht, the Splendor. That evening, there had been a lot of drinking and fighting between Wagner and Wood. The next morning, Natalie's body was found in the water, as well as the dinghy that she may have been trying to use. The autopsy for Natalie showed a 0.14% blood alcohol content, which is quite high, as well as a motion sickness pill and a painkiller. Could she have been trying to get away on the dinghy and go ashore to get away from the fighting? Other reports were that possibly the dinghy was banging against the yacht, causing a disturbance in Natalie's sleep, and she was trying to move it and fell in. Or was it something else? 2 witnesses that were on another boat close by said that they heard a woman scream for help during the night. Why didn't anyone help her? Natalie had always had a fear of dark water. Why would she be outside the yacht at night alone and intoxicated, where she could easily lose her balance and fall into the water? Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, but in 2012, that would be changed to drowning and other undetermined factors. The coroner's office would add an addendum to the autopsy report stating that the bruises that were found on Natalie may have occurred before she went into the water. In a 2018 report, it was stated that the 2013 addendum also reported that there were fresh, unexplainable bruises on Natalie's right forearm, left wrist, and right knee, as well as a scratch on her neck and a scrape on her forehead. These bruises were substantial because they were fitting of a person being thrown out of a boat. Robert Wagner would be named a person of interest in the investigation, stating that he was the last person to see Natalie before she disappeared. Had the fighting escalated on the deck of the yacht, and was she pushed or accidentally fell in? Does Christopher Walken know more than he has stated to the police? I really don't want to speculate on what happened, but I will say I always found this case rather odd and made no sense. Why was no one looking for her? Or had they spent enough time looking for her? Who knows if we will ever get the whole story about that night. Natalie was taken away too early from her family and fans. She was only 43 years old. You have to admit that that is a lot of death attached to one film. You can also say that maybe this could be connected to a lot of movies, and we just haven't looked into it yet. Now for our last dive into tragedies that plagued the Griffith Park grounds. It was the night of October 31st, 1976, when 22-year-old Rand Garrett and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Nancy Jeanson, parked themselves at picnic table number 29 for a little romantic interlude. At some point during their stay at, or possibly on, the picnic table, a tree next to the spot fell and crushed the lovers. They died in each other's arms. Their cremated remains were scattered together in the place where they met their demise. City officials ordered that the tree be cut down. When city worker Morris Carl arrived at the spot, he got a very unsettling feeling. Leaves on the branches shook violently, and he felt as if he was going to be sick. Once he composed himself, he would again try to cut down the tree, and again the feelings came back. The tree branches shook, but this time it was accompanied by a voice saying, "Leave us alone." Other stories say the voice said, "Next time you die." Morris Carl just couldn't do it. He went back to his supervisor, Dennis Higgs, and told him what had happened and that he refused to go back. Mr. Higgs decided that he would deal with cutting down the tree himself. Whatever happened that day when Mr. Higgs went to the picnic table would never be known, because the next morning a hiker would find him dead beside the table with his chainsaw next to him. Other city workers refused to go anywhere near the table or the downed tree, and it was decided that they would be left alone for nature to deal with. To this day, the remains of the table and the fallen tree on top of it are still there. The picnic table is located about 2 miles from the Griffith Observatory. I visited the table but felt no unease going up to it. Written on top of the table is R.I.P. 10/31/1976, Rand and Nancy. No tree limbs shook, no unearthly voices, and I didn't really feel any sense of foreboding. The only uncomfortable thing that did occur was while I was looking at the table, an older man on a bike rode by. He said to me as he pedaled by, "That's the lover's table."
That's the lover's table. That's the lover's table.
Now, the reason why I use the word uncomfortable is just imagine those words being uttered by the preacher Cain from the Poltergeist films. He sounded just like him, and it made my skin crawl. I have read many different stories about the history of picnic table number 29, some more detailed than others. If you've watched some of our other episodes, you know I really like to do a lot of research on whoever or whatever I'm reporting on. I looked through newspapers from around the date of October 31st, 1976, and found nothing on a couple getting killed in Griffith Park. Having read their ages, I tried to find any information on a Rand or Nancy around the same ages as the two in the story, but found nothing. No birth certificates, no death certificates. I looked up both the city worker and his supervisor, and again nothing. I could find nothing about the story until around the 2000s, which makes me believe that this was about the time the legend began. That's right, I use the word legend because it seems to be just a tale. I don't know about you, but I was bummed by this revelation. With stories about curses and tragedies, reports of hauntings are never far behind. Griffith Park has been said to have ghosts roaming around it too, according to legend. Even during the time of Griffith owning the land, farmhands would say that the ghost of Don Antonio had been seen from time to time. The spirit of Dona Petranilla has been seen wandering the land dressed in white. Another ghost, believed to be Griffith J. Griffith, has been seen riding a horse at night. Peg Entwistle has also been seen by multiple people wandering the trails, perhaps on her way to the Hollywood sign. A strong scent of gardenias has been smelled by people who have encountered her, the same fragrance as her perfume. There are so many stories of ghost sightings near the merry-go-round, the observatory, the old zoo, and all around Griffith Park that it would probably take another episode to list them. Griffith Park is rich with history, both good and bad, but that can be said about anywhere in the world. Is there a curse that caused so much destruction and heartache? Maybe, maybe not. Griffith Park is an immense area that I'm sure has the same amount of violence and misfortune as anywhere else in Los Angeles. You can decide for yourself if you believe in curses, but what I can tell you is that I learned a lot about the area, from its infancy to the present time. I hope you enjoyed this journey of events as much as I did presenting them, and I hope that the people's lives discussed here have found peace wherever they may be.